Welcome to today's Urban Food Policy Forum on Can New York City Make Groceries Affordable? Lessons from Municipal Food Retail. I'm Nevin Cohen. I am a faculty member at the CUNY Graduate School of Public Health and Health Policy, and I direct the Urban Food Policy Institute, which is located at the CUNY School of Public Health. Um, we're gathered here at a pivotal moment for New York City's food policy. 3 weeks from today, Mayor-elect Zohran Mamdani will take office, having campaigned on a bold promise to make New York City affordable. And central to his platform is a proposal that's ignited spirited debate across the city, the creation of 5 city-run grocery stores, one in each borough, that would sell food at affordable prices by operating as nonprofit public retailers. This proposal has struck a nerve. It's been called a lot of things by various opponents and proponents because it speaks to a challenge that millions of New Yorkers face daily. For those of you who are not familiar with New York City's food security landscape, despite being one of the world's wealthiest cities, New York struggles with a profound food insecurity, facing about 1.4 million people. The number is probably much larger than that. Families spend a growing share of their income on groceries, and some neighborhoods, even if they have retailers, lack access to affordable, healthy food. And in New York's interesting geography, we have large public housing developments with thousands of households in affluent neighborhoods, gentrified neighborhoods, who have food retailers around them, but many of those retailers are selling to a more affluent customer base, and so therefore unaffordable to low-income residents in those neighborhoods. The conversation sparked by this proposal extends beyond the specifics of the campaign platform. It forces us to grapple with fundamental questions about the role of municipal government in shaping food systems. Should cities be direct players in food retail, or should they focus on supporting and regulating private markets? Can publicly owned stores operate sustainably, financially sustainably, without becoming a drain on taxpayers? What would public food retail mean for equity, for public health, and for competition with existing retailers? And in New York City, we have a unique retail landscape, which is dominated by independent grocers, not necessarily large national and international chains. And these aren't merely theoretical questions. Cities and governments have been experimenting with public food retail for a century with varying degrees of success. The U.S. military has operated commissaries for over a century, serving millions of military families while saving them on their grocery bills. International examples from Singapore to Uruguay demonstrate different models of government involvement in food retail. And right here in the U.S., we're seeing renewed municipal interest from Chicago to Atlanta and other cities in finding innovative ways to address food access challenges. New York itself has been in the food retail business for a century, starting with Mayor Fiorello LaGuardia, building public food markets, subsidizing supermarkets, and supporting farmers markets and green carts. So today's forum brings together an outstanding group of experts who can help us to understand what works, what doesn't, and what's possible. We'll hear from Bill Moore, who led the Defense Commissary Agency, a $4.7 billion operation serving nearly 240 stores across 45 states and 13 countries. He can tell us what it actually takes to run a successful public grocery system at scale. Lori Prickett from Invest Atlanta will share insights from Azalea Fresh Market, a public-private partnership that's testing a different model, leveraging both public investment and private sector expertise. Ruby Ferguson, who serves as Chicago's food equity policy lead, brings a critical perspective on ensuring that any municipal food retail model centers equity and serves those most in need. And Errol Schweitzer, with deep experience in commercial grocery and food policy, can help us understand how municipal retail might coexist with or disrupt existing food retail markets. And their complete bios are available in the chat, so I will save time and not give them long introductions, just mention who they are when they begin to speak. We'll also hear from 3 New York City voices: Lauren Drumgold from the Mayor's Office of Food Policy, Bianca Bachman from Riseboro Community Partnership and the New York City Food Policy Alliance, and Corinna Lee from GrowNYC's Wholesale Food Hub. They'll respond to the panelists and help us connect the broader issues and lessons that they raise to specific opportunities and constraints facing New York City. The questions before us today aren't easy ones, and we're not going to answer them all today. This is the beginning of a discussion that I hope will extend beyond today's forum. Our goal today isn't to come to any firm conclusions, but to begin an informed, nuanced discussion that can help the incoming administration, policymakers, advocates, stakeholders, and residents think more clearly about what's at stake in New York City's food system and what's possible. So let me start with a general opening question for all panelists, one that goes to the heart of today's discussion. What's the policy case for municipal food retail, and what's the business case? In other words, why should cities consider entering the grocery business, and how can they do so in a financially sustainable way? So without further ado, let's start with Bill Moore. Thanks for joining us.
Oh, thank you, Professor Cohen. I'm honored to participate in this important initiative. Urban food is a challenge, globally actually, and not that I had a lot of grocery stores in urban areas, but had some, so I had to deal with some of that as well. As Nevin said, I'm Bill Moore. I'm currently the president and CEO of More Insight, a consulting company that helps other companies to succeed in the defense and retail industries. I was the former CEO of the Defense Commissary Agency. As Nevin said, nearly 240 stores across the U.S. and around the world, including Korea, Japan, Italy, Germany, Turkey, just everywhere we had military stationed and military families. The purpose of the Defense Commissary Agency, or DECA, as I'll refer to it, just using a military acronym as we love to do in the military, is to provide lower price groceries to military families, giving them a taste of home wherever they may be. But in the end, and this was congressionally mandated, delivering those groceries at a significant savings. The legal mark I had to achieve, and I reported quarterly to Congress, was a 23.7% savings over local supermarkets. And that was independently measured and reported quarterly back to Congress. In the previous administration, the Secretary of Defense asked me if I could do better than that, and we actually increased that metric to 25%. We had to get an additional funding amount to do that, but but we ended up achieving about 25.5% savings over local supermarkets, which meant we were essentially selling all of our products at cost, and all of our operating costs were covered by the taxpayer. So when you do all the math, and I am really summarizing a very complex business model here, but when you do all the math, the annual appropriation I was getting was right around $1.4 billion, and that paid primarily for our manpower, so all of the salaries and costs of that, as well as utilities and facilities costs and such. Meanwhile, the cost of the products, we would generally sell them at basically a nonprofit approach, where if we bought it for $1, we'd sell it for $1. And that way we were able to provide the savings, where a typical grocery store has to cover all of those operating costs. And in the end, their margin may only be 2 or 3% of profit that they make, but they have to pass all those operating costs on to the consumer. So hopefully that makes sense. Just a few points I wanted to tell you. I mean, the reason Congress enacted the law that provides for the commissaries really is to improve quality of life of military families. Generally, those lower enlisted soldiers, sailors, airmen, Marines. They don't get paid well, but they have a lot of entitlements that they receive, and this is one of their most vital benefits, actually, because it lowers their operating costs. So a typical $200 grocery bill in a week, they were only paying $150 at the commissary. As I said, independently measured and assessed. While we were doing a lot to try to modernize the commissaries while I was on board, improving point of sale, improving promotions, and most importantly, trying to improve the supply chain where we had better and fresher products on the shelf when the military families needed them. So uh, the $1.4 billion appropriation or investment the country was making in the commissaries actually had a return of somewhere between 1.7 and 1.8 billion dollars in savings. So this is one of the few um, benefits that a military family gets that actually more or less paid for itself and putting money back into the pockets of our military families. And when I say military families, it's not only the active duty military, it's also their dependents, retirees, all disabled veterans have the authority to shop the commissaries, and certain civilians, especially overseas, both State Department and Department of War employees overseas get to shop the commissaries and get that taste of home. Um, Transportation costs, I should have mentioned earlier, also covered in that appropriation, which is significant when you're looking at trying to move product all the way to Korea, as an example, very expensive proposition there, and trying to offset some of those costs. So that is the business model of the commissaries. It's successful. It's not cheap. Um, I think there are some lessons you can take as you consider what you want to do in New York City. We actually have a commissary in New York City at Fort Hamilton, and a very small one. Um, and it's servicing, frankly, retirees, not a lot of active duty military in New York City, but that's okay. Um, but that particular commissary is alive and well, and we actually have supply chain into that store. So with that, just a couple of things you may want to consider. From a supply chain perspective, it's fairly complicated in supplying a grocery store. You have some things are brought in directly by a vendor, some things are brought in through a distribution and warehouse network, and some things like produce and certain meats may be brought in separately because the delivery schedules are so different for fresh items like that. So, things we'll need to consider as you go from concept to a realistic plan and how you would create these five initial grocery stores. And the one thing I wanted to leave you with was, think about as uh, a certain author says, starting with why. I mean, what do we hope to achieve with this initiative? How much do we want to save the folks that will be authorized, and how do you determine who is authorized to shop these boroughs? For me, it was easy. All the military, to include the retirees, get something called a common access card through the military, has tons of information on it. All they had to do is flash that CAC card, as we called it, and they could get into a commissary. And then they would save 25%. So I had a clear end state, a clear outcome I was trying to achieve, and I knew how to allow the appropriate folks to get into the stores to get the savings. We'll need to consider what are you trying to save them in the end. Um, Price is probably the biggest issue. I don't think it's as big a problem in New York City as in other urban areas, but accessibility to food in an urban environment is also a growing problem in a lot of cities, with grocery stores just kind of pulling out due to crime and lack of profitability. So, two major reasons why this is so important. And with that, Professor Cohen, I'll hand the floor back to you, and we'll take it from there. I'm open to questions. I left out a whole lot, but hopefully you got the gist of where I'm coming from in my 3 years as the CEO of the Defense Commissary Agency. Thank you.
Thank,
Thank you for
thanks so
the
much.
attention.
Thank you so much, Bill. That was really, really helpful, and it's a good segue to Lori. Because Atlanta had a sort of different set of assessments. What was Atlanta's sort of policy case for moving forward, and what did you do, and what's the business case behind it?
Thank you, Professor. Lovely to be on here with these food access allies of mine. I'm very proud to be on this panel. Atlanta's very unique. I mean, from the policy standpoint, municipal food retail is a strategic tool for the city of Atlanta to create market failures, advance equity and health goals, and embed reliable food access into how we plan and we invest in neighborhoods. Now, the business case, which is my lens at Invest Atlanta as the economic development authority for the city of Atlanta, it's municipal food retail is an economic development asset that anchors neighborhoods, that reduces leakage, that creates jobs, that attracts private and philanthropic capital over time, and delivers measurable long-term savings and value across the city's economy. So we're very proud to have created an alternative municipal grocery store model by combining public real estate control, strategic subsidy, technical support for operators, innovative food retail formats, robust community governance, and data-driven performance management, turning grocery from a private market challenge into a public infrastructure solution. And so for us, we are trying to build a food access system that isn't dependent on a single operator or a single model. It's creating an ecosystem where public tools, private partners, community leadership together make it possible. And I have a very ambitious goal with an amazing mayor that says that every Atlantan will live within a half mile of fresh, affordable food by 2030. And this is our work in order to do that.
Wonderful. Thank you. And I look forward to hearing a little bit more about Azalea Fresh in our Q&A. Let's turn now to Ruby from Chicago. Brandon Johnson, the mayor, had also pledged a public grocery store model, but the city has gone through some planning and maybe has come out with a different set of goals and objectives. But maybe you could tell us about Chicago.
Yeah, and thank you so much for everyone being here today. My name is Ruby Ferguson. I am an employee at the Food Bank in Chicago, but detailed to the mayor's office to staff Chicago's Food Equity Council. I think it's helpful and it's super exciting to see so many friends on the space. So excited to share space with you all. I wanted to start, I think there's a helpful kind of context to sit in when we talk about Chicago. First and foremost, the Food Equity Council was an opportunity to think about how city government could work very closely with food leaders across the city to think about how we're addressing inequities in our food system. And I want to lean on the language of inequity because that was very intentional. It's not a matter of addressing food security, but inequities across the board and thinking about our food entrepreneurs because communities have solutions for food access, but oftentimes the barriers that exist are the root causes of hunger altogether, right? Which is poverty and racism across the board. And so originally the Food Equity Council did not have a priority that was focused on retail specifically. And my hypothesis is that because that was really focused on how do we support food entrepreneurs, and if there's an access to capital, we'll have those independent retailers there. We've seen in a lot of other cities and with leaders like New York that there have been a lot of initiatives to incentivize retailers to come, but not a lot of priorities on making them stay. And not a lot of priorities on creating a pipeline of retailers outside of our larger big box retailers that are kind of thinking of from a national perspective. And while we were starting up the Food Equity Council, the story of many major cities is that multiple retailers started to close and leave in areas that have had historic and devastating divestment. And so we went on this big journey of what role can a municipality play? And so oftentimes when a grocery store leaves, folks look towards the mayor to say, why is this grocery store leaving and how do you get them to come back? But like was mentioned on the call, a lot of times this is a private business making a business decision and is maybe maybe not committed to the outcomes of a community area and the priority of having a retailer there. And so this is where the exploration of what a bigger role of a municipality could play in keeping a retailer. And I want to call that out explicitly because we see a lot of incentives, like I mentioned before, to come, right? Tax incentives, identifying space, et cetera. But how can you support with the operating costs long term so that way the retailer can stay while other development happens around it? So my colleague Lori on the call mentioned how important food retail is as an anchor business for other development in areas. But it's kind of a chicken and the egg scenario, right? You need the retailer to stay, but you also need other businesses to create foot traffic for folks to come there. And so this was an exploration to understand what could it look like for a municipality to say in organization with like our Department of Planning, this is where we want a retailer. We're going to work on getting housing here. We're going to work on getting other businesses here to kind of wrap around and make sure that this anchor business is thriving. We've had some of an evolution, and I think process is incredibly important. And so the announcement that Mayor Johnson made was around a feasibility study. And what that feasibility study was is it possible for a city to do this and what would it take? And then we took the beginning findings of that feasibility study to food leaders across the city. And the feedback was, and we are different from New York in that we don't procure food. So there's not kind of a procurement arm readily available. We have lots of examples of concessions and we have farmers markets like many other cities. And the feedback from food leaders was, how about you focus on bringing a public market? We do not have a public market in Chicago. And so thinking about bringing a public market and thinking about a more holistic strategy around markets instead of bringing a grocery store. And the example I give all the time is we have multiple examples where the city of Chicago operates concessions, where we might contract with vendors or other things like that. And how can we use that as a food access kind of leverage piece? And so kind of within that context, circling back to the policy case and the business case, I love that Bill brought up the importance of the why. I think it's also important to think about who is impacted and who might be harmed when you're making decisions around this. And so I call that out because in Chicago, we're balancing a food access and a food insecurity issue. And sometimes your solutions cannot be all of those things at once, right? And so to Lori's point around retail leakage, we have a lot of community areas where, yes, there's a high rate of food insecurity, but there's also a equally high rate of retail leakage. And the stories that are told around our neighbors who may not have a high income is that they cannot afford to shop. But the reality is that spending power is there. And we see that with the changes in SNAP of the billions of dollars that could potentially leave our economy with SNAP participants not being there. And so how do we think about a food access solution where there is a place for folks to shop and be in the space, and then potentially lower some cost items from there? So that's a little bit of context from Chicago and a little bit all over the place. But I know there'll be some follow-up questions from there.
Really, really helpful. Thank you, Ruby. And Errol, you've been in this space for many years, and you've been thinking specifically about this proposal. You've even run some numbers. What's your take on the sort of policy and economic justification for this proposal?
Yeah, maybe I'll give a little sense of urgency here, since I do come from the grocery industry, and like Bill, have management responsible for a very large-scale, complicated organization. So here's some numbers. So compared to 2021, food prices are up 25%. On the other hand, units sold, consumption is actually down 5%, which is a drop-off of over 13 billion units. May have something to do with the 47 million Americans that are food insecure, heading to food banks, maybe a little bit because of GLP-1, not sure. Either way, it's a big number. Grocery price hikes have outpaced the rate of inflation by several points from 2021 through 2023. The gap actually grew as the consumer price index, the CPI, cooled off. The top 10 most consumed categories, this includes beef, soft drinks, eggs, milk, salty snacks, etc., they've increased in price by over 60% since 2019, corresponding with a 1.5% decline in unit volume. So what does this mean for me and you and our shopping trips? So in 2019, my average basket of groceries cost me maybe 36 bucks. In 2025, closer to $60. And then so this is really important when we understand how grocery stores operate. The increase in price since 2019 is actually equal to or greater than the cost of doing business for most grocery stores. These grocery stores' gross margins. As Bill talked about, how the commissary system doesn't take a gross margin. It's fully funded through public subsidies. Most grocers, the vast majority, have to have a markup and or margin in order to pay the bills, pay utilities, pay overhead, labor. Those markups right now, it's more or less, what the cost increase has been since 2019. So in order to bring consumer prices down to 2019 levels, grocers would literally have to sell everything at or below their wholesale costs. Obviously not possible, not viable. Also want to talk about bigger picture, the US grocery industry. New York is unique, I want to say. As somebody who grew up in New York, I kind of took it for granted. Unlike most other cities, New York is not heavily monopolized by a couple different chains. In most major cities, you have 1, 2, or 3 chains, typically a Walmart, a Kroger division, or an Albertsons division, or in the East Coast, Ahold Delhaize, like Stop and Shop. These 6 grocery chains control 65% of grocery share nationally, including Costco. The top 4 over 50%. Walmart alone has 60% market share. So New York is unique in that it's diverse. You have thousands of independent grocers and cooperatives. However, the smaller operators tend to have a hard time negotiating the best wholesale costs without the antitrust enforcement to prevent price discrimination, which is something that I've written quite a bit about. Now, when you go into the grocery shelves themselves, most categories are dominated by a handful of market leaders. It looks like you've got a diversity of products in grocery stores. However, 4 or few companies control 60 to 85% of meat processing, depending on species, 93% of soda sales, 80% of candy, 75% of yogurt, 72% of breakfast cereal, 60% of snack bars, 66% of frozen pizza, 60% of bread, 80% of toothpaste, etc. I like to actually call them the grocery cartels. It actually fits the Oxford definition of a cartel. So what does this mean? Well, beef prices are up 40%. Volumes are down 12% since 2021. And you have this consolidation in the meat sector. It's not just avian flu. It's not just drought. It's not just reduced cattle raised volumes. Soft drink prices are up 46%. Volumes are down half a point. Top 3 companies control 80% of the marketplace. And this one's like really blatant to me. As a major lover of tater tots, the top 4 companies who control 70% of French fry production, they raised prices within a week of each other in 2022. Prices have increased subsequently by 56% just since 2019. So it's no wonder inflation is rated as the biggest risk to the U.S. economy by a vast majority of Americans. The CEO of GoFundMe said the economy is so bad, people are crowdfunding to pay for groceries. Over 70% of Americans are financially stressed. And as Professor Cohen said earlier, you have at least 1.5 million New Yorkers who are, by the definition of food insecure. You have over 25% of New Yorkers who live below the poverty line, particularly in the outer boroughs, such as where I was raised in the Bronx. And so one point I want to just say here, if you want to solve for affordability, you have to address the retail prices. And a public grocery sector, whatever it is you choose to do, has to do a number of things to be viable. It has to negotiate low wholesale costs in some way, at or below that of other grocers. It has to fully subsidize retail markups or margins in some way. And that includes rent, utilities, labor costs, taxes, etc. And you also have to figure out how you can sell the best, healthiest foods. Because the one thing I didn't talk about is there's been a huge range of studies that just came out talking about the health and impacts of ultra-processed foods. So I'll close from there. But these are hard numbers. This is grocery math that every grocer lives and dies by. And if municipalities want to get into the business, you have to respect the math and you have to apply that math towards the goal, which, as Bill said, should be around access and affordability. Thank you.
Oh, thank you, Errol. Very sobering and important ideas to really consider. I'm going to turn now to Lauren Drumgold from the Mayor's Office of Food Policy. We have three respondents who are going to give their response and also ask the panelists questions. So, Lauren, would you take it away?
Yes, hi. Hi all. Thank you to the CUNY Urban Food Policy Institute for the invitation to join today's discussion, and to our panelists for being here and sharing your wealth of knowledge in your respective roles. I'm Lauren Drumgo. I'm a policy advisor at the New York City Mayor's Office of Food Policy, and our office works with city agencies and partners to make sure New York City's food system is more healthy, equitable, and sustainable. We're really thrilled by all the national momentum around this topic to address food access and many of the barriers that residents face across the country, whether it's related to the affordability concerns, availability, or infrastructure, are also felt here in the city. So I'm glad to be here and share some of the policy discussions and ongoing work that's happening here in the city related to access and affordability, and to bring a few questions to the panel that reflect what we're thinking about here locally. So as a part of the city's chronic disease prevention plan, our office convenes city, community, and academic partners to share expertise and exchange knowledge and develop a research agenda. And that agenda outlines a few priority areas for further exploration around affordability and access, including related to food pricing, as Errol has mentioned, food retail, and choice and behaviors, while recognizing that the need to understand our local context here in the city. We've also been closely following the different conversations nationally on municipal grocery stores and other examples of local government leadership stepping forward and prioritizing food access in areas that have little to no accessibility. And so the many ideas and challenges and innovations in this space, we're learning from other cities, and that's helping us to think about how to expand food retail in areas with limited access to fresh and healthy foods. We know that neighborhoods with limited food access are often those that have experienced historical disinvestment. That's the case here in the city as well. That's left communities without the resources they need to thrive and lead healthful lives. Um, Also, as we continue this work, we're thinking deeply about how we center community voices, not just in identifying their needs, but also, what are the community's aspirations and their local knowledge, and how do we make sure that their expertise is also informing the work that we do, especially knowing that, with food retail and these different initiatives, the community are the ones who are going to be benefiting from it. So we might want to make sure that it aligns with what their interests are as well. So for that, grateful for this panel. I'm especially grateful for the City of Atlanta for sharing your insights, and I would love to learn more about the Azalea Market partnership that you all have and the other food retail investments that you've made possible, as well as to the City of Chicago for the lessons that have emerged from the municipal grocery store exploration. So with that, my first question is to Ruby and Lori. As there's different ways to tackle food access and affordability, and within city government, there's budget constraints that push us to make those tough decisions about, what approach should we make? Wanted to know, how did you land on your respective models for investing in food retail, and one that would effectively deliver benefits to the most?
Thanks, Lauren. Laura, do you want to start off?
Yes, thank you, Lauren. I love that question. So you talked about community, you talked about everything, but Errol talked about expertise. Now, we knew going into this that we need the expertise of food industry individuals. So we went into a fact-finding mission of understanding trends. So we worked with a partner called the Independent Grocers Alliance, and their whole responsibility is support the independent grocery stores. And we really got a pulse of understanding the industry, the market, some of the bottom line numbers and understanding who we needed to work with in partners in that fold, whether it's wholesalers, whether it's community members and local businesses. But how Azalea came to be was an exploration of an alternative model that really brought in both the city funding as well as the individual operator and business support as well, and their buy-in. So it was a model that hadn't been done before. And so this was a way of ensuring that the right individuals and the right operators are in place. So, as anyone in economic development knows, you roll out an RFQC and you understand where there's operators out there, who's done business, who has stores all around. And we were able to select an operator, and that was called the Local Grocers LLC. And so this was an existing grocery operator. And basically what we then did was look at the real estate opportunities. We looked at mapping and data-driven information of exploring where the opportunities were. So yes, you're hearing about the Azalea Fresh Market in downtown, but we're also looking at our second location being open in Q1 as well. That's also in a disinvested neighborhood and food desert. But I'd love to talk about what you see in the news, the Azalea Fresh Market in downtown. So downtown was an existing food desert, and we knew this operator was going to work at a location here. We saw trade radiuses. We saw who was going to be there. You had universities downtown. You have a growing business community downtown. But what ties us all together, everyone? Food, and having that access to food. So this was a location that we went into collaboratively, where it was a mix of funding that kind of risk shared through public financing tools. So it was the investment by the operator, but it was also tax allocate. We call them tax allocation districts, TIFs to everyone else. We looked at how we do job incentives, so middle wage job incentives and grants that went with that as well. And then we also worked out a grocery loan program as well. So it wasn't fully grants. It was a grocery loan fund that we did with the operator as well. And that made us so we were handshaking for this. We want to see the sustainability. We wanted to know that this was going to be here for years to come. We had known that we don't want to throw money at this. We want to go into partnership. We want to ensure that the community gets a sustainable pathway to food access. And so that's where the Azalea Fresh Market came into. But I'll tell you, Lauren, the thing I love is that we talk about community. This was a full, well-rounded approach. It was the city with the private and everything that came into with the community's needs, buying trends of that community, and then understanding. Just a little plug on Invest Atlanta. We have an amazing community development that was looking at houses and commercial realty and investment. How do we ensure this is a well wrapped around approach to doing things? But we couldn't do anything, Lord, without understanding what other amazing cities had done. And so that's why I'm very proud to be on this panel, to know that if it wasn't for them, we couldn't be in the position where we're at now to explore other models and understanding of how we were going to do things.
Thanks, Ruby.
Yeah, I can chime in, and I feel like Lori hit a lot of the big themes in thinking about how to make some of those decisions. I think the big piece that is important to unpack a little bit here is the spectrum of ownership models and what that looks like. And so as soon as we announce a municipally owned, which is intentional language, grocery store, the immediate vision that came to a lot of Chicagoans' mind was a municipally operated store, and maybe not a run one. And so a lot of our exploration has been understanding what is the difference from a subsidy to us owning it, to a ground lease, to an operator? How do we get folks involved? And what does that relationship look like there? And how can we offset costs, to Errol's point around how important the financial decisions retailers are making? How could we have a green space or a white space that folks could step into and be able to operate, and that we could support long term? I think the other thing is an acknowledgement of what the city is capable of doing, and the best way of doing that. And that's why we landed on this model that is more representative of concessions, because we have a lot of examples of a lot of departments doing that, where we can vend out and not do direct operation, but can support and manage that way. And then I think location, Lori brought this up, but location is so important. And so we are actually in the process now of taking feedback after listening sessions to come up with a decision matrix on where we would put publicly owned markets with input from community leaders. Because there is this big question of, is the business the catalyst for development, or is it riding the wave on existing development? That's hard to say, but it's doing a chicken and the egg, like I mentioned before, of, do you want it to be the anchor and then we hope development comes around it? Or do you want to make sure that there's already enough foot traffic to support it? And then the last thing I will say, and I don't think this is unique to Chicago, but might be a little bit of a different story than Atlanta. We have a lot of operators, but not a lot of operators that either have the capacity or excited about opening up in some of the locations we're looking for. And so that is why the evolution into a public market format, where maybe we're not asking an operator to run a 10,000 square foot store, but rather we could find smaller entrepreneurs that could manage individual stalls, felt like a better fit for Chicago, because we have examples of a lot of developments that have space for a brick and mortar grocery store to step into, but there's not an operator who is ready to step into it and take it on. So that's some of the thought process we've had here.
Thank you. I don't know, Lauren, if you have any quick follow-ups. If not, we'll go to Bianca.
Thank you. Thank you so much for holding this forum, and for having me, Nevin, and the CUNY team. Errol came out with an article today, and it's in Forbes, and he actually touched on a core part of my work, which is it's a collaborative effort where we're building out a first of its kind community-owned and Black-led food hub. It's going to house the consumer-owned Central Brooklyn Food Co-op as the retail shop. The Brooklyn Packers will run a worker-owned wholesale distribution center. There'll be a greenhouse led by Isabalia Ladies of Elegance, a longtime community organization, and a community kitchen and business incubator space operated by Urbane Development, with worker co-ops, food-based worker co-ops incubated by Riseboro, my organization, selling into the space. It's all at the bottom of a 280-unit affordable housing building called Steps at Saratoga, and it'll open in 29. The project all started, and this is key to this conversation, because in 2021, HPD put out a request for proposals that had an emphasis on community wealth building and wellness to redevelop this huge piece of city-owned property in this still low-income but gentrifying Ocean Hill. Sold to the development partners, Riseboro being one of the development partners, for $1. This is the kind of city investment that are not only allowed for, but actually encouraged community ownership in the food system. So in my work, I'm thinking a lot about all the elements that create long-term equitable access. I believe sustainability and self-sufficiency is core to that. As CFA pointed out in their grocery access pillars document, which is also included in your materials today, grocery store churn, as Ruby was talking about, increases displacement risk in gentrifying communities. It often shifts the affordability and availability of culturally relevant stores. So, of course, like in my dreamiest of dreams and so many of our dreams, we all hope that not only does the Mamdani administration succeed with the public grocery effort here in New York City, but that he actually proves the concept enough that it's obvious for future administrations to keep funding it. But a little part of me is worried. Like, what if they don't? Might we build all these incredible publicly owned markets and then poof, like 8, 12, 16 years later, they're just defunded and they shut down? I believe in community ownership in part because it has the power to weather the storm of changing administrations and priorities and changing conditions, especially those using the cooperative model, which are proven to survive all kinds of external shocks. Ruby, you talked about this very thing I'm thinking about how we can build lasting ecosystems. I also heard you saying that the food leaders in the city are asking for a public market. Who is in that market? Will there be a community or cooperative ownership aspect among the vendors? Maybe you don't know that yet, but I'm curious about the intention there. And then to Lori, in your last comment, it sounded like maybe there's one operator, but earlier it sounded like maybe there were several. Are there any private operators in the Atlanta, in your model that are actually community led? And can you say more about how values were a part of the discussion of how operators or an operator was chosen? I also have another question, but I'll hold it until you.
Thanks, Bianca. So, Ruby, do you want to take that first?
Yeah. One, Bianca, what incredible work that you are doing. And thank you for introducing community wealth building into this conversation, because I think that that is incredibly pivotal. And so more to come on cooperative models. One of the members of the Food Equity Council is Upside Down Consulting, who does a lot of work with Shy Fresh Kitchen, which you should look into. It's a Black woman-owned cooperative that's doing really incredible stuff. And what I will offer is there has been a lot of conversations in our listening sessions of how does city maybe own the building initially, but that there is some kind of offloading or giving the building to community in a future state where there's an ownership model, where there's kind of this tiered responsibility over time. I also just want to acknowledge the comment you made at the beginning of a fear around things disappearing. And I don't know how we change this narrative, but I want to offer to everyone that like retail is hard. And I think people forget that because it's also a key like pillar of success or a key pillar to communities. And I don't know how we have this conversation, but like cities have to start to get weird and explore innovative ways to address retail access and then be on the journey with our community leaders if something doesn't work and figure out how to pivot. And so I want to offer that and introduce that because no city in the United States has figured this out. Otherwise, this would be a different conversation and we'd all be copying and pasting. And so I think forums like this are just incredibly important to just call out that like what we have done hasn't worked. And so, yes, we need to explore community wealth building and we need to explore how vendors are a part of owning, et cetera.
Thank you. Lori, how was community factored into Azalea?
The community was the foundation for everything that we do. So, team, when you begin this journey, there's a lot of data sources, but can I tell you what Atlanta is all about? Hitting the ground running. Like for me, we were out in the community, really risk assessing all operators. We had a map knowing what all the operators of food access, and we wanted to know, were you saying you were a grocery operator even though you only sold a banana in your grocery store and that's what you considered actual grocery? We went into the communities. We went in and really got a pulse of the needs of the community. And to be quite honest with you, Bianca, the needs of the community and the needs of the operators in the community, because we want to see them thrive as well. So you don't want to, yes, you want new models, but you also want to retain and really reinforce the existing operators moving forward. And so really we went to the community, getting an understanding of the needs, and you've got to build community trust. I think we're all knowing here food access is not something new. Just because we're hearing it in the news and it's a highlight, we all know that these things are here. And you have to create that community trust before you start putting these things into place. You've got to have strong operators. You've got to have that flexible capital. You've got to have those solutions and conditions and create conditions for the long-term successes of this. So you asked Bianca about the operators, and you said, is it one, is it two? For the first two locations we will have, it is one operator. But we qualified a lot, Bianca, because we're ambitious. So it doesn't have to be just one operator. Everyone can come and have a piece of the pie and really thrive in this ecosystem. Not just one operator, many operators. And so, Bianca, the biggest thing for us was treating the model as more infrastructure instead of retail. It was embedding financial tools and neighborhood planning around what we were doing. And I tell you, team, if there's nothing else I stress to everyone here, is the value that technical assistance matters just as much as the capital that you put in. So I can't stress that enough, team. And that's something that we did not only in collaboration with the Independent Grocers Alliance, which was our technical assistance provider, but also understanding how do we utilize this to learn the lessons and then to keep the sustainability model there as well.
Great, thank you. And I also want to mention that Bill or Errol, if you want to respond as well, please feel free to. This question of community and whether it strengthens the bottom line or makes it more complex is, I think, an important one to consider. And how do we ensure that community involvement and cooperative ownership and those sorts of models actually enable and facilitate access to capital and strengthen the business model for these models. Let's turn to, unless you have a quick response, I'll turn to Corinna for her reaction.
No, I just want to say, like, thank you so
Sure.
much. I'm so excited to hear more about your projects, and it's great.
Likewise.
Hi, everyone. Thank you to all of the panelists for the very stimulating presentations today. I'm Karina Lee. I'm the director of Grow NYC's Wholesale Food Hub program. Grow NYC is best known for our green market farmers markets, but over the past decade, we've also built out a wholesale food distribution program. Earlier this year, thanks to city, state, federal, and private investment, we were able to open up our new regional food hub in Hunts Point, Bronx, to further expand our work supporting local procurement in the regional economy. We currently supply nonprofits, institutions, restaurants, small food businesses, and our own Grow NYC farm stands, which are a flexible fresh food access model that is operating in neighborhoods that are currently underserved by private retail and grocers. Our farm stands accept SNAP and multiple other nutrition incentives, and we're able to distribute as the wholesale backbone to our farm stands. We're able to supply those farm stands with fresh perishable produce. Because our wholesale program manages the back end supply chain behind these food access points, we see firsthand every day the operational and financial realities that shape fresh food distribution and supporting food access in New York City. So with that currently on my mind, I'd love to pose a couple of questions. These questions are for all of the panelists, but I think especially for Errol and for Bill. So my first question is, Errol, you mentioned in your comments earlier that New York City lacks the monopoly or the monopsony structure that's dominated by big retail chains. The city's food economy, however, is still shaped by a lot of large distributors and generally a retail landscape where thousands of independent operators create intense price sensitivity. So I'm curious to hear what your thoughts are in terms of like how municipal grocery stores or any format of public market for that matter is able to navigate a supply chain where they lack that buyer leverage, not just against one big chain, but against a system where distributors are setting the terms and setting those price ceilings.
Well, I'm almost giddy that you asked me that because I've been writing about public sector supply chains now for over 5 years, and I specifically originally stayed away from retail. I only started working on how to develop a retail sector after the Mamdani campaign made their announcement. And I was like, oh, this is interesting. This kind of random mayoral candidate wants to do this. All right, let me start thinking this through if they're actually serious. But 4 to 5 years prior to that, I had only been thinking about public sector supply chains specifically because of the questions you're raising. Grocery stores are the sum total of their supply chains. I sometimes think of them as like the facade of a spaghetti western movie, like when old Warner Brothers cartoons. They're really nothing without all the wholesalers, producers, farmers, etc. They don't just get food from anywhere magically. Wholesale is incredibly consolidated. I would call it incredibly corrupt and incredibly thin margins. New York City, to its credit, still has a more diverse wholesale sector than most other cities. I'll say that. However, the bigger wholesalers, particularly in packaged food, produce, etc., still control a large portion. And I want to say this is an estimate because I have never seen good academic research on retail wholesale research. I've seen plenty on food service. Everybody knows how bad US Food and Cisco is. More Perfect Union just did a great video about it. But try to find more than a few articles about CNS, which also acquired Spartan Nash, which services military commissaries. I wrote in depth about United Natural Foods a few months ago because I helped negotiate their largest retail contracts for over a decade. KeHE, which had purchased Tree of Life. And I'm talking about things that most folks on this call have no idea because wholesalers are the invisible middlemen, huge, huge operators between the manufacturers, like the brands you see on shelf and the produce, and the meat, and the retailers, right? And the stores. It's a huge bottleneck. And it's absolutely essential. You cannot just walk in and regulate it to hell and blow it up. You have to understand first how it operates because you start moving things around and things break to the point that when United Natural Foods had a cyber attack in June, on the low end, it easily affected 10 million consumers. It easily affected 30,000 retailers over the course of a couple of weeks. And you'd go into these stores, far-flung stores, there'd be vast shelves that were empty. And like, what happened? There's no COVID. There's no, supply chains were okay. No, this one wholesaler that services this whole sector of the economy. So I wrote about the need initially to invest in public sector supply chains. Good Food Purchasing Program posted it on their website. It's still up. I could drop it in the link because that is actually, to me, foundational if you want to do public sector retail successfully. And I know that's not what we're talking about here, and that's not what the campaign ran with, and that's not what has attracted all this energy, which I want to encourage. I want to operationalize it. I want to see it happen, and I love the diversity of ideas here. But Karina's question is crucial, that whatever you're doing in the public sector will still be dependent on private sector supply chains and all the issues, all the challenges that any other retailer faces, which I mentioned earlier, include price discrimination, which is it's not being enforced against, that mass market chains demand better prices, which I've started to see data on that drive up the prices of independents and cooperatives, right? It's not enforced. Or the fact that, larger scale suppliers prioritize, and even smaller scale suppliers. So it's something that I think needs some serious consideration and funding. And in the meantime, and I know we worked on this when I was in Austin, developing food hubs and community-based responses to it in the meantime. But once again, research is needed, and you have to understand currently how it operates. Don't break it because everybody depends on it. And it's not, and it's a complicated and deeply, deeply problematic sector. Thank you.
Bill, I wonder if you could comment a little bit on the DECA supply chain and this question of wholesalers and their role.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with everything Errol said, and DECA has four distributors. CNS and Spartan Nash were two of the four. And there's a lot of concern that CNS acquired Spartan Nash. So now we're down to three that provide that whole middle management of product and getting it to the stores. DECA being a global grocer, it's a public-private partnership in the U.S. in that it relies on those now three distributors to get product to the stores. We do own our distribution overseas. So these private distributors load the ships, and then when the ships or planes arrive overseas, it's our warehouses, our employees, and frankly, I love that part of DECA's supply chain. Most of your more successful large grocers own their distribution, the middle manager basically of their products, and then they buy direct from the OEMs, the manufacturers. DECA buys direct from the manufacturers, but then pays the distributors to move the product, which is a little unique, not a typical wholesale model, but it worked and it allowed us to negotiate better prices directly with the suppliers, and seeing the work. I mean, honestly, I wanted to bring it back to a more commercial model, and my successor, John Hall, is still studying how he might do that. But in the end, we are still victims of the wholesale side of the business. And like I said, everything Errol said, I could just foot stomp. We wrestled that every day. Even selling products at cost, you got to get that cost down to as low as you can in this incredibly competitive market. And you've got to stay on their priority list of distribution. I mean, if they're getting a better price with a better grocer, you're not going to get your product. And I wrestled that a lot because we would negotiate great prices and then we couldn't get the order filled. And it's like, what good is a great price if you can't buy the product, right? In the end, you know, that family needs those diapers wherever they are in the world, and we've got to make sure those diapers are there. Frankly, I was actually flying diapers to Korea at one point of my tenure at DECA because the shipping lanes were we had some issues with the shipping lanes, and I had to eat that cost in order to get those diapers there. I mean, it's just things you do day in and day out as you try to service your consumer base, and it all comes down in the end to getting feet in the door. And if they lose confidence that you're going to have what they need, they're going to look elsewhere. And so you've got to consider that as you go from concept to reality. I don't know if that's hitting your mark, Corinna, but anyway, hopefully that helped.
Professor, would you mind if I came in with also a local approach as well to this question? Because I think probably the question your audience and even the panelists will say is, wow, you did one azalea market. Why are you doing two so quickly? And one of the reasons it was because of two stores gave us the buying power of a small chain. So that meant lower wholesale prices, reduced freight cost, shared production, a more negotiating leverage for our operator. And so every efficiency we unlock gets us back to serving Atlantans the affordable food. So that's how we've looked at it. Our operators worked with our wholesaler, which is AWG. So these are the things that we've also, and I can't echo enough the importance of distribution. And that's something we're also looking at as well.
Great, thank you. Corinna, did you have any follow-up questions or?
No.
No, but if I could add one
Yeah.
point, Corinna, just I didn't really get into the produce side of things, but and how that relates to locally acquired products. I am a huge advocate for buying local. There are some food safety considerations you have to go through. Our commissary systems actually had military veterinarians at every location that assisted us tremendously on, especially on meat and produce, remaining safe. And overseas, you had to be particularly careful of buying local. But that said, it's a huge win for the consumer. It's usually fresher, it's usually healthier, and it's usually much cheaper because you don't have the transportation costs involved. So, um, how you break through on locally produced items on your shelves is huge. In Hawaii, for example, I had 4 stores. 15% of my product line was local, and the consumers absolutely loved it. And it was a huge part of our revenue at those stores.
I'm so
Kevin, can I
happy
just
you brought that
oh,
up. Can I just jump in with one quick follow-up to what Bill just shared? So as we're kind of like discussing various municipal grocery models, I think that regional supply chain, I think is definitely on the table in terms of like how much this will be centered in those conversations. But a lot of local and regional sourcing can raise like those per unit costs just due to lack of scale and other supply chain constraints. Curious to hear kind of like what your experience has been in terms of being able to successfully move local regionally sourced products at scale through like the DECA network.
that was pretty much my question.
Sorry.
And no, but I just want to add to it before they answer, which is um, it's local, but also what about other values? What about paying that farm workers are being paid well and that, everybody kind of along the food chain is being paid well. The Brooklyn Packers, who's going to be the wholesaler for a lot of what's happening at Steps at Saratoga, has a lot of values baked into who they source from. And as a result, their food is more expensive than sourcing from a massive wholesaler, right? But that's really important to us that everybody along the food supply chain is paid really well and that food is sourced sustainably and locally and all of that. How do we I mean, this is like the question of the whole food system problem, but like how have you all brought this like these values things and still kept all of your brilliant economic questions at hand at the same time?
Harold, do you want to go first?
I think it's really important to have purchasing and supply chain standards and frameworks for buying. I do know New York City has adopted values-based purchasing. I know that Chicago has looked at it, worked on it. We talked about it in Austin and implemented it in public schools. I think several dozen cities have over, several dozen public institutions. These standards, which are developed by the Center for Good Food Purchasing, were based on private sector quality standards that folks like myself and my colleagues were trying to implement and operationalize in grocery stores, which included buying more sustainable, organic, and regenerative and local produce, factoring in fair labor, as well as purchasing standards like the Coalition of Immokalee Workers, Fair Food Program, not allowing not allowing suppliers who tolerated sexual assault and rape on their farms, legally binding requirements to make sure that those weren't in supply chains, as well as humanely raised meats, etc. So this exists. However, it goes back to a lot of what I've already said. There are bottlenecks and there's a lot of resistance in supply chains. There's not a lot of middle market infrastructure. Pretty much anywhere you go within the supply chain, even if you find a supplier that you can source from that has all these standards, like a Brooklyn Packer, if you end up with a middleman or somewhere else, you're probably going to find problematic aspects of their business. So you can start implementing and requiring these. And the magic here is really what I've been trying to emphasize. If you develop a system where you're figuring out how to have the most efficient at scale, wholesale, and retail model, utilizing the best practices of grocery math, and you're figuring out and fighting for and winning the ability to subsidize retail markups, you can do so much more than what we are talking about here because you have that math and that you have that leverage in the supply chain. And really, like I said, New York is already a leader in this. As much as you're probably frustrated that not enough has gotten done, at the scale of New York already buys $500 million worth of food in the city and is figuring out where they can do some of this values-based purchasing here and there. You got to keep pushing for it. And that's how we develop supply chain standards in the private sector. You just keep plugging away at it. You keep converting suppliers. It's the power of the purchase order. Like Coalition of Immokalee Workers says that if these folks want to do business with you, and the bigger you are, the more they're going to want to, the bigger those purchase orders are. And I want to throw one other thing out here to sort of combine some of these themes. You need to start thinking about municipal cooperation, that you need cooperation between municipalities to combine forces on supply chain purchasing and standards to create more leverage so that suppliers know you mean business and that you're serious in what you're hoping to accomplish, and that you can actively compete with the Tysons and the CNS and all the supply chain infrastructure that is inertial to everything that you're trying to achieve.
Thank you. Any other quick comments to Errol? If not, I have a question. I want to get back to the sort of the math question of if we're talking about a pilot program with 5 stores, what is the rough subsidy required to reduce the cost to the consumer? What are we talking about in terms of infrastructure and overhead? Does anyone want to, and question for Lori is, are there any kind of affordability criteria built into the contracts with Savvy in Azalea Fresh Market? So I don't know who wants to jump into that fray about like what kinds of costs are we talking about? The Mamdani campaign had talked about $60 million to start, but I want to get a reality check. Is that a reasonable estimate?
I mean, I can talk to the capital stack that went behind Azalea and the two stores combined. So it's around $8 million of city subsidy that's going in. I mean, 11 million kind of total when you're looking at equity from the operator, and then you're also looking at potential relationships with additional funding mechanisms coming in and partnerships. And these are the kind of like, this is where your experts come into play, Professor, where I'm not going to lie, economic development professionals are not like an Errol here that can literally tell you kind of the feasibility study of grocery stores and what it's going to take. So you need those professionals to be able to engage you and give you that expertise on how much the build out of these municipal operations cost. I can only talk to that capital stack, but on providing funding for the inventory, that's not something that we subsidized, Professor. We didn't subsidize the inventory.
No, thank you very much. That's helpful. And I have a question from the audience, and we are taking some questions through the chat. So if you want to raise a question, please put it in the chat. An audience member says, for Bill and Errol, military commissaries have a 1.4 billion appropriation annually, and I hear the 1.7 billion in savings. If you scale down to the number of stores to 5 to 20 in a given city, what should cities be planning to budget to start something like this? I don't know if if you can even give a rough estimate, but
Yeah, and Nevin, I'll take a shot at it, but I can't really in terms of real dollars because it comes back to volume. Volume is king in retail. I think a planning factor that we measured and is fairly accurate, and I think it sounded like Errol's research kind of backs that up. 25% of that gross margin of a typical grocery store is covering their operating costs. So if you can subsidize the operating costs and sell at cost and following the DECA model, then you're going to save those customers 25%, which should increase volume depending on location of where you put the store. Um, but that said, 5 stores is a very small operation, and you're probably going to have to pay a little bit of a premium for products. So you're going to have to factor that in, I think, into the investment cost here. I'm just, thinking out loud on that. Errol, you sounds like you have thought this through a bit.
Yeah, and I have family in New York who was asking me what I thought about it, so I had no choice. Yeah, I don't know where they got the idea for 5 stores. I know that the campaign has put a lot of thought into housing, childcare, and transportation, and looked at alternate models elsewhere. Maybe because a lot of these models don't really exist yet, or they were not aware of military commissary. I don't understand the 5 store model. A colleague of mine, Raj Patel, and I did some modeling, both for Civil Eats as well as for community food advocates. So I'm just looking at the 5 store model, a $60 million, first year investment. And this is just first year. I estimated, based on my experience opening a lot of stores, 10 million in startup, leaving you about 50 million in annual operations. This would break down to about 190,000 in weekly revenue per store. I mean, that's really a large bodega. It's a corner store. And so to Bill's point, not really going to give you any leverage in the supply chain for cost negotiations. I don't know how you're going to negotiate wholesale costs or ensure good deliveries, fresh product, all the other things that all of us in the private sector sweat at night in terms of actually getting product to stores, let alone fund the operation. So, we put together a alternate proposal, very modest, a 20-store chain, which is not terribly large, but also it's not too small for New York City, modeled at $1 billion in retail, which would mean that it would be more expensive to start up and then to operate, but much more impactful in terms of being able to reach a lot more people with having 4 to 5 stores per borough, which would also cut back on logistics costs. And from my own experience, when you have like a 20-store chain doing $1 billion in a small geographical area in New York, that probably gets you a little better along the way towards getting better wholesale costs, getting better priorities from your suppliers, as well as being able to pivot to a lot more local product as well, because you're a significant buyer. So these were sort of initial models that we've put together. In the CFA report, we've got a lot more numbers in detail.
Thanks, Errol. We have a lot of questions in the chat. I know we're not going to get to all of them. I have a question for Bill from Tim Kessler at the Department of Health. Was there ever resistance from local stores to the commissary subsidized model? Because we have heard in this discussion about public grocery stores from the private sector that this is unfair competition with private grocers. So, any reactions from private vendors located around the commissaries?
Yeah, I mean, I kind of inherited a very mature model, and there was acceptance, I think, that it's just a real threat to their business. But I can tell you, Walmart came after the commissary market with a vengeance. There is a Walmart outside of every single base that that I had a commissary on, and frankly, I had to, you know, compete with that. And they were killing us because they were selling a lot of products below cost. A lot of it, not a lot, but key products like milk. They were selling milk at half of what they were paying for it. We were selling milk at cost. So the consumer would walk in, see milk at double the price of what they could buy it at Walmart. Mentally, they would extrapolate that to mean everything in the commissary was twice as expensive. And I mean, they were beating us. And Congress had to give us authority to use a variable pricing model to where I could sell certain products below cost, compete with our competition, and then recover that loss in margin on other products, like every grocery store already does. And that was huge for us. And frankly, I was doing a web scrape of pricing and selling our milk 10% cheaper than whatever they sold it, and we would lose that money monthly. But back to the question, Yeah, there's going to be resistance, and Errol's concept here is I think awesome, but my mind did immediately go to those independent grocers are going to lose. The advantage, not really an advantage, but a factoid here is that they're small buyers as well. So they're probably already paying a premium for a lot of products. I don't know how that might work, and how they may have co-opted between the independent grocers to maybe buy cheaper. But figuring that out and figuring out how to compete, it's all, you got to beat the competition. And so you got to think your way through that. And if there are supply chains already set up, how do you tap into them at a low cost? I think will be important and be ready for the resistance. I mean, it's going to be there. For every winner, everyone that buys in one of these municipally owned grocery stores is a lost sale on the private sector. I mean, it's just a fact. So we got to, accept that and consider it over.
One thing I
Thanks.
just want to quickly add, Professor Cohen, to Bill, and I agree with pretty much everything he said, is when you factor in the food insecurity rates, I would suggest that New York City model out what the incremental revenue would be if you actually factored in full consumption of New Yorkers who are food insecure. Because what we've really concluded was that the private sector has experienced a market failure here. And it's not that people don't love their corner bodegas or their neighborhood grocery stores or are standing in line for 2 hours at Trader Joe's. It's not the point. There's also, I mean, really significant food insecurity that seems to be growing. However, how do you translate that into an opportunity for meeting those needs, meeting those consumption needs? And I translated that with national data. I calculated 13 billion fewer units sold in 2025 versus 2019. That's nationally. I don't have New York data. I'm assuming it's more than proportional because New York, I think, is a more extreme response. So while I do agree with Bill that yes, there will probably be cannibalization on the private sector, and this is the way we always think about opening new stores, what is the incremental opportunity here to meet consumer needs? And in this case, this is all about access and affordability that the private sector is not currently able to meet in its current incarnation. So I would look at it, not to use a for-profit term, but an upside here, that you may have a lot of folks who can actually benefit from these without the private sector losing out. So that would, to me, would be a prediction, and I would like somebody to work on some modeling of that to see if that bears fruit.
Thank you. Question from getting back to the wholesale side of things, from Karen Karp, a colleague. What about collaborations with public wholesale markets like Hunts Point in the Bronx, or public markets in other cities to lean on these markets and possibly expand their capacity and resilience to be suppliers for a public grocery market? Any thoughts from any of the panelists about that?
Sure, of course they will. I mean, Hunts Point already services, a lot of the local and regional grocers, so I wouldn't see why not. And I would hope that that's a priority, and that they develop additional partnerships with folks like Brooklyn Packers or hopefully new, cooperatives that develop as well. So I'd hopefully make it a priority. And it's a wonderful, unique infrastructure that New York City has around Hunts Point and Grow NYC.
Thanks. Kathy Nonis, another colleague formerly of the Department of Health, notes, I'm worried that we're forgetting about the independent grocers in high poverty neighborhoods, and these grocers are going to be seriously affected by SNAP cutbacks. And shouldn't we be shoring these up rather than instituting new stores? Any thoughts? And you've probably heard the same arguments in Chicago and Atlanta. Any thoughts from the panel?
You can do both, Professor. You can do both. The same tools that start and drive new ideas, the ones that can sustain them as well. So it's not a one or the other. Let's get out of the one or the other. If one's creating, that's got to be pulling from others. That's why when we learn about trade radiuses and not market saturation, all those things, that's where mapping comes into play. That's why understanding your footprint is so important here. And you can do both. But like I said to you, with the existing operators, here's the thing, two things. And this is what my operators would tell me and tell me all the time. Lori, two things. I need money to keep the lights on, because that's the average day of a grocery operator making very small margins here. And number two, I need to be ahead of the game and be competitive with learning what's new and what other people are doing and how I can improve my business model. So hence why you need to ensure that there's funding partners in place, whether that's from the government side of the house, but also working with CDFIs that are really important that can support local businesses, but also to the technical assistance. We talk about those things, updating POS systems, updating equipment, financial modeling, all those kind of things, marketing, which is massive here. And so why it's got to be so important. It's not one or the other. It can be both, and you can continue to really drive and make a strong food ecosystem as long as you do that.
Ruby, do you have some thoughts?
Yeah, I think my only build is there's an assumption of competition, but when you look at many community areas that have a higher socioeconomic status, there's multiple grocery stores. And so when you look at shopping patterns, regardless of income, folks are going to places where they can frequent multiple stores at once and get their favorite things from different places. And so I love that Lori brought up the language of a food ecosystem, because oftentimes when we're thinking about low-income communities, we're under the assumption that one grocery store checks the box and that solves the problem. But really, historic divestment has removed so many things from those locations. And so how do we think about supporting all of the things? And the last piece I'll add is, anecdotally, in a conversation with one of our newer independent retailers here in Chicago, I brought up, like, how would you feel if we brought a public market down the street, with the assumption that, like, it would be an absolute no-go? And she was actually thrilled by the idea because, again, it brings foot traffic. And so there are a lot of instances where grocery stores have opened up, but there hasn't been anything to bring foot traffic to that location. And so I think that multi-factor approach is important. But I see Errol's hand, and he probably has a much more sophisticated answer.
No, I was going to just respond with one quick blunt point. I completely agree with this possibility that maybe instead of opening up municipal stores that you subsidize retail markups, you just have to start thinking of, like, well, if you want it to be impactful, what will that cost? Start at $1 billion. Think about it. 1.5 million New Yorkers are food insecure. What if you gave them $1,000 a year? Who spends $1,000 a year on groceries, by the way? I mean, that's probably closer to what some of us spend in a month. Well, that's $1.5 billion a year. So if you're starting to think about, well, what's the best way to improve access and affordability? Yes, I think you keep all the tools in the toolbox, because you can't sort of just you have to go in to solve these problems. These are systemic problems. And something like this, when you look at the impact of SNAP is a $100 billion subsidy, not only to the consumer, but to the US grocery industry, but it's only, $180 a month. $6 a day. It's nothing. It's starvation, really. It's barely above starvation. If SNAP were to be impactful, you're talking about that should be $500 million a year. So if you're thinking about $500 billion a year, $500 billion a year. If you're thinking about a New York-based program, make sure the math is serious, because I think that is going to give you better perspective on what could be more impactful versus doing some outlets for food. And it may be that both are. And it may be also that, as the cooperatives are doing in New York, maybe it's the supply chain infrastructure as well. But I would keep all tools in the toolbox.
If I could just add one thing, and Errol, I'm so glad you brought this up, that, like, opening a grocery store is not a solution for food insecurity. It is the other things that you layer on top of that that address food insecurity. And I like want to name that because that often gets conflated. So I love that we talked about procurement practices where you can figure out how to lower the costs. But really, when we're talking about food insecurity, people need a thriving wage, not a grocery store. And that is the difference and the distinction that we need to call out here.
Mhm. Bianca?
Yeah, just real quick, I wanted to add that the recommendations document that Errol and myself and others worked on for the Mamdani administration includes a whole section on food area designations. So basically what we're proposing to the city is do these 20 public grocery stores, not five, do invest in cooperative infrastructure and invest essentially city-owned lots and other kinds of subsidy and support to small business owners to support this kind of thing that Ruby was talking about. I'm going to go shopping here for this and here for that and here for that. Actually invest support for that. So I think it really is and that's what we are proposing to the administration and that they're going to be in talks with us around. So hopefully that will move all of that.
Mhm. Thanks. And one quick follow-up from Raj Patel, and it's asking us to consider the state government and governance models that include the state, because obviously resources are available at the state that the city can't garner. And any thoughts from the panelists on the role of New York State in this proposal, or examples from Atlanta and Chicago?
I mean, we worked with the state on with their program. It's called Georgia Grown, and that's with the Georgia Department of Agriculture, and that's something we work with them, connecting the farmers, connecting the farmer networks together. I mean, that's how we've worked with the state, more on the procurement piece of things.
Mhm. And I want to ask one other question from the audience, and I think we're going to be out of time, unfortunately. But that's any examples of or potential for collaboration between, say, DECA um, and a municipal market system, or intermunicipal collaboration, as Errol, I think, talked about earlier, to have larger supply chains and more efficiencies.
Nevin, from the DECA perspective, I mean, they're pretty constrained on what they can do outside of the boundaries of the mission based on the funding profile. And, Congress very specific. We give you this money to do this function, and there's a ton of lawyers looking over our shoulder at all times, making sure we are complying. That said, um, the distributors and many of the brokers are all private companies, and they may see an opportunity here where you could tap into part of DECA's privatized supply chain and perhaps leverage it. They're already it's a very small commissary in the city, but that said, there's still items coming into the city every day to service that store, and they may see this as a way to kind of grow their business in the city in a way that might lower costs for that particular store while providing a value to the city. So uh, not with DECA directly, but I see a potential opportunity with some of the service providers of DECA, if that makes sense.
Mhm. Thank you. Unfortunately, this has gone by very quickly because the discussion has been, I think, really, really exciting and interesting. And I want to thank the panelists and our responders for sharing your knowledge with us today. I'll give the floor to anyone who wants to make any final comments, but then we're going to have to wrap up. And to the audience, thank you for your comments. We'll try to um, uh, share some of those questions and comments with the panelists after the after we end this session. and we will be uploading the recording of this session in about a week's time to the School of Public Health YouTube channel, and we'll notify everybody of its availability. Any final thoughts? And if not, I want to thank you again, and note that this has to be a conversation that is to be continued.
I would just say that Mayor-elect Mamdani is inheriting a moment of opportunity. And just remember, you don't go at these things alone. That's why you got city partners. We're showing, just like Atlanta says, Atlanta's a group project, so is this. So be bold, be driven, and if you need any of your sister cities or your partners' support, that's where we're here to support you.
Thanks, Lori. That's a great note to end on, I think, for this discussion. So thanks again, everybody, and thanks to all of you who participated as audience members.